Hey folks, this is Dan and Toka, and we're here to talk about how we finished our weird little game, Kouhai Quest, in 48 hours for the GMTK 2020 Game Jam. To give a bit of background, we've been working on two projects for the past year or so. One of them, Craft and Slash, was actually from the previous GMTK Game Jam. We'd been so stuck working with the same problems and drawing in the same style that we figured GMTK 2020 was a good time to get a breath of fresh air and section off 48 hours to make something entirely different. Let's get right into it. One of the best parts about any game jam is that after a few days you'll have made something from nothing. So how do we get started on the path to making something really awesome?
We decided beforehand we wouldn't retroactively fit an idea into the theme. We did that for Craft and Slash for GMTK 2019, and trying to shoehorn a theme into an already existing game mechanic was trying to do too many things at once. So before the jam even started, we decided to use Unity and pitch some feelings we'd aim for, rather than actual game mechanics. When the jam did start, we got right into a voice call to talk about the theme, which was out of control.
We immediately decided what we didn't want to do. Anything obvious like using mass numbers to overwhelm the player or removing control like WASD movement was off the table. We thought these ideas didn't sound fun to execute, and it's likely they would be done 100 times over since they were the first things to come to mind.
Even though we shut down those possibilities, Jen and I generally kept to the principle of turn off the critic and turn on the creator. It's hard for the brain to juggle creating and judging, so give yourself some space and play with whatever idea catches your eye. Otherwise, you'll be pausing every few minutes to second guess yourself, wondering if the scope's practical or if the player would even enjoy the game.
When we ran out of initial ideas, we turned to guiding principle number 2, look outside of video games for inspiration. This idea is taken as a derivative of a famous Hayao Miyazaki quote: "If you don't spend time watching real people, you can't produce something real, because you've never seen it."
So we started by digging into somewhat true-to-life sources like TV tropes, before eventually looking up out of control in the dictionary. The sentence that started Kouhai Quest was, "Never before in her life had she been so attracted to a man, so totally out of control in his presence." Which eventually led to this.
You're like a teenage girl, and there's this guy you really like. Every time you're near him, you get hella butterflies in your stomach. Then one day, they're really bad, and your stomach turns into a weird alien thing with floppy legs. You have to get away from him before he sees you like this.
Dan and I went from here, layering on one impractical idea after another. At the peak of the concept, we had a game where an alien was holding a game dev hostage and forcing them to write a visual novel. The dev in turn was controlling a character in the visual novel and making choices for them. The goal of the game was to try to influence the human into writing a novel that you, the alien player, wanted made. It was our attempt to abstract game mechanics several degrees away from a normal visual novel experience.
At that point, we figured it was time to rein ourselves in. We'd already made a huge creative space to work in, and now we were ready to bring back the critic. We need to pare our ideas down into something both good and doable within our remaining 40-ish hours. To figure out which of our ideas might actually be good, we applied what we called the gray box test, not to be confused with gray box testing. For a given game idea, we ask if the game is fun if every element is a simple gray box. We ask ourselves this question since we want to figure out if a game is truly good at its core, and since potential for polish is always uncertain in a short game jam, so a game needs to be good even if it looks like crap. When we finally talked about what would become Kouhai Quest, our gray box test looked like this. You pull a stretchy gray box to launch other gray boxes into a goal zone, and this determines which actions your blank canvas character takes. Does this idea sound fun? Putting the game in this context allowed us to see what the game was at its core, a visual novel where you make decisions with a goofy minigame. It sounded pretty fun and doable, and lined up with the theme of out of control, so we went forward with it. The second task was this: does our skin enhance our gray box gameplay? When we applied our skin to the gameplay, it seemed to fit perfectly. The decision-making context becomes asking out your high school crush, which, well, typical, is an easy to understand and fun idea to explore. The physics minigame becomes a stomach scene where you have to literally throw up your words to speak. It definitely enhances the core game idea. Finally, the penultimate question was this: can we execute on this idea in 40 hours minus sleep? To determine our scope, we have to cut our game down to the minimum viable product. Finding your minimum viable product means removing as much as possible while still getting your idea across. What it came down to was this: a physics scene with a stretchy stomach, words that you can launch upwards, a basic visual novel dialogue system, and some really basic narrative to sell the idea. It's important to recognize that everything on top of this is extra. It's obviously really nice to have music, sound effects, great visuals, and extra flavor, but they're not essential. You have to make sure you can complete your game before anything else. It's important to note that we have the huge luxury of a programmer plus artist combo, so Kotocca could actually work on a lot of polish while I completed the main game.
For artists, an MVP means you'll need to schedule your time. Figure out how long it'll take to make concept art, in-game assets, UI, and how long it'll take to implement and animate them. These assets will have to be generic and reusable, but also slightly stylized with personality, which is easier said than done. For me, this meant no liner on UI, purposely rough shapes, and a basic looping idle animation since you can set those up without code. You'll also want to focus on assets that'll take up most of the player's attention. The majority of my time is spent tweaking the stomach colors and the character designs. Another tip is to take as many shortcuts as possible. Pixel art, cell shading, or a simple but charming art style will cut down on hours of rendering while still looking polished. For this project, I used gameplay as inspiration since Kouhai Quest already had a fairly humorous game mechanic and premise. The game's main draw was the contrast between a cute, cheesy outer world and a visceral inner world. So naturally I landed on an art style that combined comic line art for the rooftop scene and textured brushstrokes for the innards. Other games in the jam like Video Exorcist and Pink River were able to pull off a cohesive art direction by either being a one-room game, repeating assets, or using a simple art style. Whatever your skill level, you'll need to be prepared for cuts in quality and quantity because of time. Here's a few things you can do to support your programmer. The first is to get in placeholder art ASAP. It'll be easier for the programmer to implement the scene, and it gives them a head start in finding visual bugs. You can always tweak the art later, and if you don't have time later, you probably don't have time now. Another thing you can do is research VFX that you really want in the game, but might take a while to set up. Decide which ones need to be worked on first, and which ones will likely be cut.
Well, that just about concludes our advice on making a well-designed, original game in 48 hours. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments what you learned. Kotocca and I are continually working on games as Pure Jam, so if you'd like to get notified whenever we release fun new games like Kouhai Quest or Craft & Slash, sign up for our newsletter down in the description. Cheers, and have a lovely summer.